On a hot August night in 1969, Los Angeles police arrived at a Benedict Canyon mansion to discover a scene of almost unfathomable horror. The word pig was smeared in blood on the front door, and inside lay the bodies of five people, including 26-year-old actress Sharon Tate, who was over 8 months pregnant, as well as her friends. They'd been stabbed, shot, and brutally slain by intruders who left behind eerie, ritualistic signs of carnage. The following night, two more victims, Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, were found murdered in a similar frenzy across town. The words Helter Skelter were scrawled in blood on their refrigerator. These atrocities, known as the Tate-LaBianca murders, shocked the nation and marked a grim turning point in American culture. The perpetrators were members of a cult-like group that called themselves the Manson family, led by a wild-eyed career criminal named Charles Manson. Though Manson himself did not physically commit the murders, his charismatic malice orchestrated this violence and left an indelible stain on the end of the 1960s. So what follows is going to be an in-depth exploration of how Charles Manson became one of history's most infamous cult leaders. So sit back, relax, and take a deep breath. It's time to let the fresh air in. Hello, everyone. Welcome back, or welcome if you're new. My name is Erin, and I am fascinated by all things cult, true crime, and unique spiritual practices. So if you're into this sort of thing, please consider subscribing to the channel. I would absolutely love to have you here. I've been oscillating for a while now on, do I want to cover this case and this cult? Do I not? Is it overdone? Does everyone talk about it? And for whatever reason, I just felt like now was the time. Maybe you'll learn something new. I try to make my deep dives like the deepest you will ever find, but there is just so much content on this subject. So I really hope you do enjoy my takes. We are going to dive into some of the psychological and early life situations that Charles Manson found himself in. I learned a few new things, so that was good. So maybe you will too. So let's go ahead and jump right into Charles Manson's early life. Charles Miles Manson was not destined for notoriety from birth, but his troubled beginnings set the stage for the dark path that he would later carve. He was born on November 12th, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio, to a 16-year-old mother, Kathleen Maddox. His biological father, a transient laborer named Colonel Walker Scott, had already abandoned the family before Charles was even born, leaving the boy without a stable father figure. Kathleen Maddox's life was also tumultuous. She had a history of run-ins with the law and heavy drinking. In 1939, when Charles was just 4 years old, his mother and his uncle were both arrested and imprisoned for armed robbery, forcing the child to live with relatives in West Virginia. Although Kathleen was released on parole after a few years, the reunion with the mother and son was short lived as her irresponsible lifestyle just continued. So it's always situations like this where I start to kind of realize, like, oh, yeah, no wonder he tried to collect a group of women around him in a tight-knit community who all listened to what he said and could never leave because he probably had some serious abandonment issues. Now, young Charles grew up in an atmosphere of instability, neglect, and criminal influence, so criminality was probably normalized to him. I mean, he really experienced little in the way of a normal, loving childhood. And by 9, he was already lashing out at the world. He once set his school on fire in a fit of rebellion. So these early years of abandonment and delinquency kind of forged in Manson a deep sense of both insecurity and also anger, And I'm pretty sure this laid the groundwork for the manipulative and volatile personality that he would later become. Now, as a teenager, Manson bounced between reformatories, foster homes, and even the streets. Petty crimes like theft and burglary escalated into more serious offenses. And by 17, he had been sent to a boys' reformatory school and soon graduated to federal prison after stealing cars and driving them across state lines. In and out of incarceration throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, Manson became institutionalized. Prison was the one place he truly felt at home. And in fact, in 1967, when a 32-year-old Charles Manson was up for release after serving a term for forgery and violating his probation, he reportedly told prison officials that he did not want to be released because prison had become his home. This is after spending more than half of his life already behind bars. And I know this was a long time ago, but I still feel like there isn't enough resources for people that do spend a lot of time in prison and then suddenly leave. And it's not that we should be like, in my opinion, spoon feeding these criminals who have done terrible things once they get out of prison and complete their sentence, but it does set them up to just do more crime because oftentimes when people do crime, apart from the people that just, I guess, enjoy it, but it typically comes from a very vulnerable place, like needing food, needing shelter, not having a way to get any income, things like that. So I can't help but wonder if, like, he was just like, yeah, prison's my home because I have no means otherwise to get a job. I have no example of what a healthy family, healthy relationships, healthy human being looks like. Obviously, I'm not justifying his behavior in any way. To me, it just kind of is like a lesson. Like, what if we were a little more compassionate to people in this situation? But then I'm like, but you also murdered people. It's nuanced, right? It's nuanced. It's one of those situations with a lot of these profiles that we talk about in true crime where you're like, why didn't no one see the red flags and do something sooner? It's kind of like that. Again, not like justifying what he did, but it kind of like makes sense that he just kept committing crimes because he like had nowhere to live and also tried to create this like delinquent group of followers around him who he made feel could never leave him because I'm pretty sure he like felt abandoned by his father and his mother. But behind those prison walls, Manson had honed an uncanny skill set. He had learned to charm, to manipulate, and to exploit weaknesses in others. Prison, as he later boasted, was his university, a training ground where he studied people and absorbed lessons from hardened criminals. He became an avid student of self help, which sounds questionable, and also occult philosophies that were available to him. But also, like, why are these materials available to people in prison? Not self help, obviously, but if it's someone who's like, how can I do a human sacrifice? Maybe just like don't give them the book. I mean, he dove into works like Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, Pulp Fiction, the Bible, and even fringe belief systems like Scientology. And look, the fact that this book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, has inspired one of the most well known cult leaders of our time. It's like shocking, but also not shocking because I always thought that book was like a script for manipulating people. It's just crazy. But also, if you have a difficult time communicating with people in a dialogue or a business setting or something where you have to kind of convince someone to see your point of view, I can see it being beneficial, but it's just an example of like when the wrong type of text, content, whatever it is, gets into the wrong hands and they interpret it however they interpret it, it could lead to like astronomical situations, like absolutely terrible situations. And Manson claimed to have actually completed 150 hours of Scientology auditing while he was incarcerated. Yeah. So this guy's like, "Oh, I'm self-helping myself. I'm getting into all of this spiritual practice." In reality, he's like grooming himself to become a cult leader. The intention is very insidious. Under the tutelage of experienced convicts, pimps, con artists, and gangsters, he learned new strategies to manipulate and influence people, and basically lost any fear of the threat of prison. So, this removed reincarnation as any kind of deterrent to his future crimes. Notably, at McNeil Island Penitentiary, Manson took guitar lessons from infamous bank robber Alvin Creepy Karpis, nurturing ambitions of becoming a singer songwriter. By the time he walked out of prison in March 1967, Charles Manson was a changed man. He had transformed from a petty criminal to someone who literally understood the nuance and power of psychological control and harbored these very grandiose visions of importance. Now, psychologically, Manson exhibited signs of severe personality disorders rather than just outright psychosis. Later in life, mental health experts would examine him and find that he was not schizophrenic, as many had speculated, but instead he fit the profile of a psychopath, displaying a grandiose sense of self, shallow emotions, and a callous, manipulative use of others. A comprehensive psychological assessment of Manson, conducted in '97 but only made public after his death, confirmed that while his behavior was bizarre, it was not rooted in hallucinations or breaks from reality that are characteristic of schizophrenia. Instead, Charles Manson's pathology lay in extreme narcissism and antisocial traits. One researcher noted that it became really clear how his narcissism fueled his need to be the focus of attention. Manson craved power and adulation. He had this uncanny ability to size people up, probe their insecurities, and then bend them to his will. These traits, a blend of learned manipulation tactics and innate remorselessness, made him exceptionally dangerous. Equipped with a guitar, a warped sense of ideology, and a chameleon like charm, Charles Manson stepped out of prison in the so called Summer of Love of 1967. He was about to put his skills to use in the streets of San Francisco and Los Angeles, gathering followers around him like a dark messiah and scripting one of the most nightmarish chapters in American history. What is it about a guy with a guitar, too, especially if they're like a little grungy? I have totally fallen for that like grungy guitar slinging musician. And I always think this is funny because I've dated a few musicians where I like really didn't even like their music, but I was like enamored by the fact that like they were a guitar player and like they were like cool or whatever, and then they were always terrible. But drummers, drummers are hot. I'm saying that because my husband is a drummer and he's great. He's a great musician too. Love you, babe. Now let's jump into the formation of the cult. So in 1967, California, especially the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, was a magnet of dreamers and drifters, riding the wave of the hippie counterculture. I mean, this is where Janis Joplin went when she basically abandoned everything she knew in Texas and decided she was going to go like be a blues singer, and she went to San Francisco and was there in the 60s during this time, and like she just blew up there. And she wasn't the only hippie slash uh like musician that fled to the San Francisco streets. I grew up listening to her. I'm obsessed with her. I've done deep dives on her just for my personal, interest. And yeah, it's really, you should look into it. It's really, really, she's not a cult leader, so I'm not going to cover her on the channel, but you should look into it. So this was an area that was full of music and fun-loving people. I mean, it's honestly the kind of place that I feel like in my 20s I would have wanted to go to. I would have wanted to flock to. I would have wanted to live alternatively and listen to music and meet more people who were kind of on the fringes and, casting out mainstream society. I feel like I would have totally been a hippie in the 60s and the 70s. So the fact that Charles was targeting these people who were probably coming from all different areas of the nation, it makes a lot of sense. And he arrived in Haight-Ashbury just as the Summer of Love bloomed, and he intuitively grasped how to exploit the era's ethos of free love, psychedelic drugs, and anti-establishment sentiment. With that guitar and the cryptic charisma he's had, Manson cast himself as a spiritual guru in the Haight. He sought out emotionally insecure young people, particularly women who felt like outcasts, and then he targeted them for manipulation. Very early on, he met Mary Brunner, a 23-year-old library assistant at UC Berkeley, and ended up moving into her apartment. Manson soon persuaded her to let other women join them in her home. And according to one account, he overcame Brunner's initial resistance to sharing her space and him with others until they had a communal living arrangement with as many as 18 women under one roof. Yeah, 18 women under one roof. 18 people in general under one roof. But if my husband one day was like, hey, let's invite all these other women to live with us. And by the way, I'm going to boink them all. I'd be like, pause, rewind. No. Now, another early recruit was 19-year-old Lynette Frome, soon nicknamed Squeaky. She was a teen runaway whom Manson encountered on Venice Beach. Manson's growing troupe lived a transient bohemian life, squatting in crash pads, panhandling, and soaking in the hippie lifestyle. To his followers, this harem of women he had collected to surround himself with, Manson played the part of the gentle philosopher and loving master. They later recalled how he could be attentive and tender one moment, but then turn cold and wrathful the next, keeping everyone constantly off balance and totally dependent on his approval. And this is a classic tactic that a lot of cult leaders, but also abusers use. They're going to make you feel like you're constantly walking on eggshells because they're going to make you feel like it's your fault if you ever trigger them into a fit of rage or otherwise. So this is just such a common tactic. And it does that walking on eggshells feeling. It's interesting how like psychologically for me anyways, I don't know that if this is like scientifically supported this next statement, but when I'm walking on eggshells around someone, I like want to make sure they're happy instead of, oh, this person makes me feel like I need to walk on eggshells around them. I should probably distance myself from this person. I've never felt that when I feel like I need to walk on eggshells, unless I finally feel so hurt by that person that I'm like, why am I worried about not offending you? You offend me all the time. You know what I mean? So it is a very clear and distinct tactic because I think that there is this feeling of wanting to be accepted. And if you feel like you're constantly triggering somebody and walking around on eggshells with them, you're going to be inclined to continue to try to make them happy. At least that's my experience. Now, by late 1967, Manson's group of devotees had coalesced into a makeshift family, bound not by blood, but by their shared allegiance to Charlie's vision. Manson preached an eclectic doctrine that mixed biblical apocalyptic prophecy, Scientology jargon, and the free love idealism of the hippie movement. He told his followers that they were the reincarnation of the original Christians, and that the modern establishment was akin to the oppressive Romans who persecuted Christ. This grandiose comparison flattered the young drifters who craved a sense of purpose in their life. Following Charlie wasn't just this fun adventure, it was a cosmic mission. Manson also dabbled in the emerging New Age spirituality of the 60s, borrowing concepts from various sources. He took particular inspiration from the music of the Beatles, seeing hidden messages in their 1968 White album. And I think we all know I actually covered Maharishi in a deep dive last year, and I went to the cult, so I'll try to remember to link that video here, just in case you guys want to go check it out. If not, I'll put it in the description down below. But they were inspired, they were like taught to meditate by Maharishi himself, and they helped him grow his cult unknowingly, and then later denounced him after they kind of realized all of the problematic things that had been going on. So it's very interesting to see all of this kind of like come together in this weird cyclical way. Now, the group's nickname, The Family, took hold as they wandered California in an old school bus that was painted with psychedelic colors and packed with mattresses and guitars. In this nomadic phase, Manson's entourage grew to about 20 or more people. They drifted from San Francisco down the California coast, crashing in Los Angeles beach communities like the Topanga Canyon, Malibu, and Venice. And you can still car camp at Venice. I went to Venice Beach a couple of years ago and there was someone with a van life van, and I always think those are so cool. And I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is like where it all happened." I don't mean necessarily this cult, but I mean the hippie movement. And there's still that culture of like being a nomad and traveling up the coast of California. It's very, very interesting. But wherever they went, Manson would play guitar and sing his folk rock songs. He fancied himself a singer on the verge of stardom. And while the young woman often romantically and sexually shared among the group, they would busk for money, scavenge for food, or engage in petty crimes like credit card fraud to keep the communal living going. Inside, the Manson family was both freewheeling and tightly controlled, a contradiction that spoke to Manson's manipulative genius. So, on the surface, the family lived like many hippie communes of the era. They rejected materialism, they shared everything, they experimented with hallucinogenic drugs, especially LSD. So, days were spent getting high, playing music, and hanging out in nature, and nights might have turned into group sex rituals or what Manson termed religious LSD trips, because you can't really have a cult if there's not some kind of sexual exploitation, right? But these psychedelic experiences were not equal for everyone. According to family member Paul Watkins, Manson would encourage the group to drop acid together, but he himself would take this very tiny dose, keeping his wits about him so he could guide and program the others while they were their most vulnerable. In essence, Manson treated LSD as a tool for mind control. So while his followers are hallucinating and emotional, he would reinforce his message about love, fear, and loyalty. Quote, Charlie's trip was to program us all to submit, unquote. And this is what Watkins would later testify. He turned normal boundaries to jelly. Sexual inhibitions were eroded by orchestrating group sex and partner swapping, often at Manson's command. He would sometimes pair off a reluctant follower with a partner of his choosing, or even offer the women in the group to outsiders. For example, to male prospective recruits or men who could provide favors like mechanics or even stuntmen who could help the family. Now, this had the dual effect of both bonding the women more deeply to Manson as the arbiter of their love lives, and also debased their sense of self so that they became, in effect, empty vessels for him to fill. Through a mix of calculated kindness, drugs, and cruelty, Charles Manson broke down his followers' identities and rebuilt them in his own image. I mean, he was the second reincarnation after all, am I right? By the summer of 1968, the family found a semi permanent home at an old Hollywood relic, Spahn Movie Ranch. Spahn Ranch was a ramshackle 55-acre former movie ranch in the Los Angeles hills that had been used for filming westerns. Its elderly owned 80-year-old George Spahn was nearly blind and struggling to maintain the property. Manson and his crew showed up and they offered to help around the ranch in exchange for lodging. So sweet and innocent, right? They moved into the dilapidated cabins and makeshift structures on the property, giving the family this secluded base of operations that was away from prying eyes. At Spahn Ranch, daily life settled into a peculiar routine. The family women did most of the chores, the cooking, the cleaning, the tending to the horses, and they even acted as seeing eye guides for George Spahn. To keep Spahn agreeable to their presence, some of the women, notably Lynette Squeaky Frome, whose nickname reportedly came from the squeaking bed springs when she was entertaining this old man, because she would have sex with him all on Manson's orders. So, in exchange, the family got to live rent free and treated the rundown ranch as their own personal playground. And I always find it interesting how these fringe groups that are led by men who are like, outside society is terrible. Get away from capitalism's structures, despite however you feel about, whatever, however you feel about capitalism. People get mad at me when I talk about politics. But I always find it fascinating how these cult leaders will always preach an alternative way of living. And then they're almost always like, and women, you need to fall in line with a very patriarchal model of how a household should be taken care of. They're like, yeah, come on, you're a free woman. Isn't this amazing? Now have sex with me and do my dishes. Okay, Charles. Now, Manson lorded over this desert commune like a cult chieftain. He established rules that on their face sounded full of hippie idealism. For instance, the members should abandon egotism and give up their sense of self. But in practice, that meant absolute obedience to Charlie. The women, often dressed in shabby, flowy clothes or sometimes went totally nude, were encouraged to discard their old identities, and Manson even gave many of them new names. Around the campfire at night, Manson would sermonize, strumming his guitar and prophesizing about the future. One of Manson's favorite themes was an impending apocalypse that he dubbed Helter Skelter, borrowing the name of a Beatles song. Because if there's anything we've learned about cult leaders on this channel is that they have no original ideas. They're all a derivative of something that's a derivative of something that's a derivative of something. Like, give me something fresh, something new. You know what I mean? Oh, there's an apocalypse coming. Oh, you're the second coming of Christ. Oh, a Helter Skelter is going to come that just happens to be a hit song by your favorite band. Give me a break. Now, at Spahn Ranch, the Manson family gradually evolved into a full-fledged doomsday cult. Manson became fixated on the idea of an apocalyptic race war between black people and white people in America, a grotesque misinterpretation of the racial tensions of the era, and of course, his own racist delusions. He told his followers that a war was coming in which the black population would rise up and overthrow the white establishment. However, according to Manson's prophecy, the black victors would be incapable of governing, being not intelligent enough to survive on their own without white leadership. Okay, so is that why, black people were slaves? Because they're so incapable of doing things? This drives me crazy. So at this point, Manson and his family would emerge and take control, becoming the rulers of a new world order, with Manson as the ultimate leader or messiah. It was a ludicrous, hate-fueled fantasy. But the family accepted, or at least tolerated it under Manson's spell. They even started preparing for it. Manson spoke of finding a hidden, bottomless pit in the desert where they would find shelter during Helter Skelter. And this was drawing on the Book of Revelation imagery to try to amplify his tale. The group made exploratory trips out to the Mojave Desert and Death Valley searching for this hideout. By early 1969, they established a secondary camp at Barker Ranch in Death Valley, testing the idea of living in the wild off the grid. Back at Spahn Ranch, Manson's preachings grew more urgent. He interpreted every news of racial unrest or Black Panthers activity as a sign that Helter Skelter was nearing. The family even wrote songs and slogans about it. And they were arming up too. After a drug deal dispute in July 1969 led Manson to shoot a black drug dealer named Bernard Lotzapapa Crow, Manson became paranoid that the Black Panthers would retaliate against him. He began setting up armed patrols around Spahn Ranch at night, turning their hippie commune into a pseudo-militarized camp with lookouts and fortified positions. Members of a local biker gang called the Straight Satans were brought in to act as security in exchange for drugs and women. So the stage was set, right? By mid-1969, the Manson family had transformed from a free love hippie collective into something darker, a cult poised for violence, all steered by Manson's increasingly apocalyptic and grandiose commands. In 1969, Charles Manson began testing the loyalty of his family in more dangerous ways. Petty crimes like auto theft and burglary were no longer sufficient to satisfy his ambitions or finance the group's plans to survive the looming Helter Skelter war. That summer, the Manson family committed a string of crimes that escalated from intimidation and robbery to outright murder. These crimes, horrific on their own, were preludes to the infamous Tate-LaBianca killing spree and kind of help explain Manson's twisted motives. The family's first known murder occurred in late July 1969 and foreshadowed the brutality that was to come. Gary Hinman was a 34-year-old music teacher and friend of the Manson family who lived in Topanga Canyon. Some family members had crashed at Hinman's house before, and Manson believed, wrongly by the way, that Hinman had come into a large inheritance. Desperate for money, Manson sent a crew to Hinman's home to extort him. Mary Brenner, Susan Atkins, and Bobby Beausoleil were dispatched to convince Hinman to hand over his assets or join the family and turn over his resources. Cool, great choice. You either kill me and I hand over my resources, or I join you and I also hand over my resources. That's not really a choice now, is it? Obviously, the plan quickly turned violent. They held Hinman hostage in his own house for 2 days, roughing him up as he insisted he had no big money to give. At one point, an irate Manson came to the house himself, wielding a sword, of all things, a sword. He then slashed Hinman's face and cut off part of his ear as a gruesome threat. Now, eventually, on July 27th, 1969, Manson allegedly ordered Beausoleil to kill Gary Hinman. Beausoleil stabbed Hinman to death while the two other women looked on. In an effort to misdirect investigators, this trio then tried to stage the scene to look like a crime by the Black Panthers or perhaps other revolutionaries, and using Hinman's blood, they scrawled the words political piggy on the wall and drew a panther paw print, which was a Black Panther symbol. And this was a crude attempt at a copycat revolutionary murder, framing Black militants for the killing. Beausoleil then fled in Hinman's car. However, just a few days later, he was caught by police and they found him asleep in that stolen vehicle on August 6th, 1969, and then discovered the murder weapon was hidden in a tire well. Beausoleil's arrest for the Hinman murder would have significant consequences. Family members like Susan Atkins were now implicated in a murder, and this raised the stakes for Manson. Now, according to some later accounts, Manson started contemplating more drastic actions, partly to try to free Beausoleil by making the authorities think that the real Hinman killers were still at large. Now, just 2 days after Beausoleil's arrest, Charles Manson set in motion the violence that would make headlines around the world. On the evening of August 9th, 1969, all to just try to frame the Black Panthers and get his buddy out of jail who had just murdered a guy, he gathered a group of his most obedient followers at Spahn Ranch and issued chilling orders. According to later testimony, he told Charles Tex Watson, a 23-year-old ex-Texan who would become Manson's right-hand man in the family, to take several of the girls and totally destroy everyone in that house as gruesome as you can. And that's a direct quote. The target was a house at 10050 Cielo Drive in the Benedict Canyon area of Los Angeles. And Manson knew this house. Until recently, it had been rented by music producer Terry Melcher, the same producer who had spurned Manson's music career. By August 69, however, Melcher was long gone, and the home was now occupied by Roman Polanski, a famous film director, and his wife, Sharon Tate, a rising Hollywood actress who was also pregnant at the time. Polanski was away that month in Europe, but Sharon Tate was home and entertaining friends on that fateful night. Late at night, Tex Watson drove up to Cielo Drive accompanied by Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, 3 female family members who Manson had selected for the task. They arrived near midnight. The hillside property was secluded behind gates and thick shrubbery. To ensure no one would call for help, Watson climbed a telephone pole and cut the phone line to the house. The group then parked their old Ford at the bottom of the hill and proceeded on foot, hiking back up toward the house's gated driveway in the darkness. As they approached, headlights suddenly swept over them. An unexpected visitor was leaving the estate. 18-year-old Stephen Parent had been visiting the property's caretaker in a backed guest house and was now attempting to drive out in his car. Watson stepped out of the shadows with a gun, startling Parent. Watson lunged at the young man with a knife, slashing him, then raised a .22 caliber revolver and shot Stephen Parent 4 times, killing him in his car before he could even exit the driveway. Why? He became the massacre's first victim, slain simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. With the element of surprise somehow still intact, Watson and the women next entered the main residence. Watson cut open a window screen and slipped inside, then let Atkins and Krenwinkel in through the front door. Linda Kasabian stayed outside by the gate as a lookout and to be a getaway driver. Notably, Kasabian was the only one of the four who would not directly participate in the killings that followed. Inside the living room, Tex Watson encountered Wojtek Frykowski sleeping on the couch, one of Tate's house guests that night. Frykowski woke in confusion at the sight of a stranger with a gun. Then he asked who the intruders were, and Watson chillingly replied, quote, "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business." And what unfolded next was a scene of sheer terror and bloodshed. Susan Atkins and Patricia Krenwinkel rounded up the other occupants of the house. Sharon Tate, who was in her nightgown in the bedroom, her friend Abigail Folger, the actual coffee heiress, and Folger's boyfriend, Wojtek Frykowski, as well as Jay Sebring, a celebrity hairstylist and close friend of Tate. The intruders herded Tate, Folger, Sebring into the living room with Frykowski. Now, Watson used a long rope he'd brought to tie one end around Sharon Tate's neck and the other around Jay Sebring's neck to try to tether his captives. He then threw the rope over a ceiling beam. Sebring protested when Watson handled the pregnant Tate roughly, and Watson responded by abruptly shooting him and kicking him until he fell lifeless. And this was the start of a frenzied amount of violence. Abigail Folger was briefly taken back to her bedroom to retrieve money. Likely the killers were searching for anything of value. But Folger attempted to escape amid the chaos. She burst out a side door and ran across the lawn, only to be tackled by Patricia Krenwinkel on the front lawn. Krenwinkel stabbed Folger repeatedly, the heiress's white nightgown turning red with blood as they struggled. Folger, remarkably resilient, cried out, "I'm already dead," as Krenwinkel continued stabbing. And meanwhile, in the house, Wojciech Frykowski had started fighting back against Atkins. Though he was stabbed in the legs by Atkins, Frykowski managed to get to the porch, but an enraged Tex Watson pistol whipped him repeatedly with such force that the gun's grip broke. Do you know how hard you have to hit someone to break a gun? Watson then stabbed Frykowski over and over again, and then finally shot him twice, killing him on the front lawn. Now, in the living room was Sharon Tate, now witnessing the slaughter of her closest friends. She was the last one alive, and she begged for the life of her unborn baby, crying for mercy. But as we all probably know, there was none. Susan Atkins later claimed Tate pleaded, "Please let me have my baby," to which Atkins coldly replied, "Woman, I have no mercy for you." Watson would later say that it was he who stabbed Tate and not Atkins. In the end, for no reason at all, Sharon Tate was stabbed 16 times by one or both of the assailants, dying agonizingly on the floor next to her friends. Before leaving, Susan Atkins followed Manson's perverse instructions, took Tate's blood, and used it to write the word pig on the front door of the house. The slaughter at Cielo Drive was over within minutes, leaving a tableau that one homicide detective described as reminiscent of a scene from a nightmare. Blood soaked the carpets and the lawns, and the brutality even shocked the most seasoned LAPD officers. Now, astonishingly, the very next night, the Manson family struck again. Flush with the grisly adrenaline of the previous night's quote-unquote success, Charles Manson himself decided, well, he wanted to set up the next one. He was determined to show his followers, I'm going to show you how to do it right with even more deliberation. Just F off, bro. In the early hours of August 10th, 1969, Manson gathered 6 family members into 2 cars, including the 3 from the previous night, Tex, Susan, and Patricia, and also Leslie Van Houten, a 19-year-old newcomer who had not been present the night before, Steve Clegg Grogan, and, of course, Linda Kasabian as getaway driver again. They cruised through Los Angeles with Manson selecting a house at random in the Los Feliz neighborhood. This was the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, a middle-aged couple who had the misfortune of living next door to a house Manson and some family members had visited once on a party excursion. Like, just why? Well, in Manson's twisted logic, any affluent house could serve as a target to stoke fear. So, arriving just past midnight, Manson himself went up to the LaBianca house with Watson. At gunpoint, they woke Leno LaBianca, who was a supermarket executive, and his wife Rosemary, and then tied them up, assuring them that it was just a robbery, they're not going to get hurt. And in truth, Manson was securing the victims for slaughter. Not wanting to get his own hands dirty, he left the house after a few minutes and then sent his disciples in to finish the job. Manson drove away with Linda Kasabian, Leslie Van Houten, and Steve Grogan to drop off Atkins and Grogan somewhere else, reportedly to attempt another murder because, one that night just wasn't enough, but luckily this one failed, and then instructed Watson and Krenwinkel and Van Houten to kill the LaBiancas while they went off scot-free. So inside this home, the terrified couple were separated into different rooms. And oh my gosh, I feel like I've heard so many stories like this where if you're a couple and someone who is an intruder separates you, I feel like you just kind of know you're done for almost. It's not going to end well. And obviously what followed was a horrific orchestration of violence. Tex and Patricia attacked Leno in the den while Leslie, at Watson's direction, tackled Rosemary in the bedroom. Leno, who was a heavy-set man, fought back hard even with a pillowcase over his head, but Watson plunged a bayonet into him repeatedly. And in the bedroom, Rosemary, armed with a lamp in desperation, grappled with the intruders until Van Houten and Krenwinkel together subdued her with stab wounds. They kept the couple alive for a torturous stretch, stabbing them, then pausing as the victims moaned in pain, and then stabbing them again. By the end, Leno had been stabbed with such a ferocity that a carving fork was left jutting out of his stomach, and a steak knife planted in his throat. Rosemary was stabbed a total of 41 times. To make absolutely sure the scene screamed cult crime, the killers again left messages in blood. Krenwinkel dipped an available towel in Leno's blood and scrawled on the walls and refrigerators the words "Rise" and "Death to Pigs," and, most infamously, "Helter Skelter." But actually misspelled the Beatles' song title, but still conveyed Manson's delusional motive. So when they were done, the trio calmly cleaned themselves off, raided the refrigerator for chocolate milk and melon, and then left the LaBiancas dead in their ransacked home. The second night of murders was, if anything, even more perplexing to police. It seemed random and ritualistic, but now 7 people had been slaughtered over 2 nights in Los Angeles, and the city was in a panic. And nobody yet realized that both nights of carnage were connected and even orchestrated by one single cult leader. Now, these 2 killings did not occur in a vacuum. The Manson family was involved in several other crimes around the same period. Earlier in the summer of 1969, besides the Hinman case and the Crow shooting incident, family members were suspected in additional violence. For example, on August 12, 1969, a man named Donald Shorty Shea, a ranch hand at Spahn Ranch who had quarreled with Manson, suddenly disappeared. It was later revealed that Manson believed Shorty Shea might inform police about the family's activities, particularly their car theft ring. So Manson ordered Shea's execution. Tex, because of course it was Tex, Steve Grogan and Bruce Davis ambushed Shay, stabbing and bludgeoning him to death, and then hid his body near the ranch. And his remains wouldn't even be found until 1977, when one of the culprits, Grogan, led police to the burial site in exchange for leniency. There had also been a canceled plan to murder an actor named Saladin Nader on the same evening as the LaBianca killings. Manson had dispatched Linda Kasabian and another member to kill a random target to further confuse investigators, but Kasabian deliberately foiled the attempt by knocking on the wrong door and giving the would-be victim warning. Hence, no one was harmed. Furthermore, long after the family's reign of terror ended, authorities have looked into the possibility that the family did commit other murders that had gone unsolved or totally unrecognized at the time. There were some suspicious deaths and disappearances between 68 and 69, such as those of acquaintance John Zero Hote or teenage ranch hand Donald Shorty Shea and others. Some suspicious deaths and disappearances in 68 and 69 have been revisited for possible links to Manson's group. It's believed by some investigators that the family's body count might be higher than the 9 murders for which they were convicted, although there's been no definitive proof that has emerged of additional victims. In those bloody summer weeks of 1969, Charles Manson had succeeded in turning his most loyal followers into killers. The rationale he impressed upon them was still debated. The prosecution at trial argued that Manson's primary motive was to ignite his prophesized Helter Skelter race war by making the murders look like the work of African American radicals, hence the bloody writings and pig references. And indeed, Manson did speak frequently of Helter Skelter and seemed determined to bring it about. However, others have posited more immediate motives. Vengeance against a showbiz world that rejected him, since the first night's victims were at the home of Manson's one-time music industry contact, Terry Melker. Or an attempt to free his jailed comrade, Bobby Beausoleil, by committing copycat murders to make it appear that Hinman's killer was still at large. Some of Manson's own comments indicate that he hoped the Tate-LaBianca murders pinned on Black revolutionaries would spur the police to release Beausoleil and also precipitate societal chaos. But regardless of the exact mix of reasons, the fact remains that Manson had orchestrated a level of violence rarely seen, and his cult had executed it with ferocity. Now, with Los Angeles in a grip of fear, the Manson family faded back into the shadows of Spahn Ranch. But their freedom would be short-lived, as law enforcement was closing in on this ragtag band of killers even before they knew exactly who they were hunting. In the aftermath of these murders, police were baffled. The sheer savagery of the crimes and the apparent lack of connection between the victims all led investigators down many false paths. Initially, the LAPD did not link the 2 nights of murders. The Tate case was investigated as a possible drug transaction gone wrong, since one victim, Wojtek Frykowski, was known to use drugs, while the LaBianca case was thought to be a copycat of the Tate killing or some kind of mob hit. For several crucial months, the true culprits, Charles Manson and his transient family, remained at large, even as they continued to engage in criminal activities. And ironically, the break in the case came not from brilliant detective work on the murder scenes, but from the mundane rounding up of the family on unrelated charges. In late August 1969, after the murders, sheriff's deputies raided Spahn Ranch and briefly detained the Manson clan for suspected auto theft. The family had been converting stolen Volkswagens into dune buggies. However, a clerical error on the search warrant resulted in their release just a few days later, and this group scattered the desert. They retreated to Barker Ranch in Death Valley and tried to lay low. But then on October 10th, 69, police raided Barker Ranch and arrested Manson and several others on suspicion of vehicle theft and arson of earth-moving equipment. The family had set a Park Service loader on fire previously. Manson was found hiding, dirty and scruffy, in a cabinet beneath the Barker Ranch kitchen sink. I don't know why that feels like such poetic justice. This guy that like builds him up to be this like badass musician who is orchestrating these murders. And he's like, oh no, cops are here. I better jump under the sink. Still, at this point, authorities had not connected these hippie misfits to the high profile murders in Los Angeles. That crucial clue came from Susan Atkins, who was in jail on charges related to the Hinman murder. Feeling chatty and boastful, Atkins confided to two female cellmates in the Sybil Brand Institute, a women's jail in LA, that she'd been involved in the Tate killings. She chillingly described stabbing Sharon Tate and even drinking her blood, a claim that was likely exaggerated for shock value. And horrified, the cellmates reported these confessions to authorities in November of 1969. Detectives suddenly realized the Tate case might be cracked. They had a witness tying the Hinman suspect to the Tate massacre, and by extension, possibly linking Manson's whole crew to both crime scenes. In December 1969, the LA County Grand Jury indicted Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten for the Tate-LaBianca murders. Tex Watson, who had fled back to Texas, would be indicted and tried separately once extradited. Linda Kasabian, the getaway driver who had not participated in the violence, promptly turned herself in and agreed to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for her immunity. Now, the trial is always so scandalous. I feel like, and I think Charles Manson and his little group of cult followers did this on purpose because it really did distract from the actual getting justice for the victims because people just could not stop talking about his behavior. This trial began in June 1970 and turned into a spectacle that both riveted and appalled the public in equal measure. It was as if the drama and chaos of the family's life moved from the ranch and into the courtroom. Now, from the outset, Manson treated the courtroom like a stage to try to exert control and send messages to his followers. On the very first day of testimony on July 24th, Manson arrived in court with an X freshly carved into his forehead. And the next day, the three female defendants duplicated the act on their own foreheads, carving X's as well, a sign of Xing themselves out of society. Oh my God, so interesting and original. This self mutilization did seemingly become a striking demonstration of Manson's influence, where family members were effectively announcing that they no longer considered themselves bound by society's rules or judgments, and the fact that they will literally do whatever Manson tells them to do. And as if that wasn't enough, years later, Manson would modify his X into a swastika, and some of his followers did the same. Awesome. Now, inside the courtroom, the prosecution's case rested heavily on the testimony of Linda Kasabian, the family member who had been present at both the crime scenes but didn't kill anyone. She was granted immunity and recounted in detail the events of those nights, from Manson's chilling orders to the grisly acts she witnessed, providing a first-hand narrative tying Manson to the crimes, even though he hadn't personally wielded a knife. Vincent Bugliosi, the Los Angeles Deputy District Attorney, served as the lead prosecutor. He presented the theory that Manson had been driven by his Helter Skelter prophecy, that Manson explicitly wanted to spark an apocalyptic race war by framing Black Americans for the murders. The motive was unusual and complex, and not all observers were convinced that Helter Skelter was the primary driving force. But Bugliosi supported his argument with evidence. The Beatles lyric references, testimony from family members like Paul Watkins about Manson's teachings, and the racial epitaphs written in blood at the crime scenes all painted a picture of a bizarre cult obsession as the rationale for random slaughter. And the defense side was chaotic. Charles Manson had initially wanted to represent himself, unsurprisingly, given his egomania, but that permission was revoked by the judge due to Manson's antics and lack of legal knowledge. He had court-appointed attorneys, as did the women, but Manson did his best to orchestrate a defense through disruption. The three women defendants, still entirely under Manson's sway, attempted to exonerate him by claiming they committed the murders independently. They would shout out that Charlie had nothing to do with it, and at one point even tried to testify against their lawyer's advice that they planned the killings themselves. And the judge did not allow this perjury to proceed, luckily. Manson, who of course was unhappy with the proceedings because he's not getting what he wants, made several outbursts like the child he is. In one dramatic moment, Manson leapt across counsel table in an attempt to attack Judge Charles Older, screaming, "In the name of Christian justice, someone should cut your head off," while brandishing a sharpened pencil. Yeah, that's not the behavior of an actual murderer, is it? It is. Now, the bailiff subdued him, but these kinds of incidents only heightened the circus-like atmosphere. And outside the courthouse, a contingent of die-hard Manson family members maintained a vigil. A rotating cast, including Lynette Squeaky Frome and Sandra Good, camped out on the sidewalk, often dressed in matching outfits with X's on their foreheads, and they would chant Manson's mantras and stare down jurors and reporters. They made throat-cutting gestures and issued thinly veiled threats. So disruptive were these family devotees that the prosecution took the unusual step of subpoenaing them as potential witnesses, not actually to call them to the stand, but simply to give cause to keep them out of the courtroom itself. This clever tactic kept the Manson clan from intimidating jurors in the galley. Still, their presence was felt. At one point, rumors spread that family members might try to hijack an airliner and crash into the courthouse to free Manson, a plot that luckily didn't materialize, but did kind of set the example of how fevered imaginations had become. Midway through the trial in November 1970, Manson supporter Lynette Frome and others staged an eerie protest by shaving their heads as a sign of mourning after Manson supposedly shaved his. The three female defendants eventually shaved their hair off too, walking into court bald to mirror Manson's look, a startling tableau of cult loyalty. And the trial stretched on for months. Through it all, the evidence of guilt was overwhelming. Kasabian's testimony was corroborated by physical evidence and the earlier confessions that Susan Atkins had made. Atkins herself testified before a grand jury early on when she was considering cooperating in grisly detail, but then she would recant it all later. Perhaps sensing the inevitable, Manson gave one final performance. After the prosecution rested, Manson requested to testify. Against his lawyer's advice, he took the stand without the jury present initially and launched into a rambling monologue that lasted over an hour. In it, he declared, quote, "These children that come at you with knives, they are your children. You taught them. I didn't teach them. I just tried to help them stand up," unquote. It was classic Manson. Part denial of responsibility, part social commentary, part mystic gibberish. And the judge deemed it irrelevant, and Manson ultimately did not give that speech to the jury. And on January 25th, 1971, the jury returned its verdict. Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten were all found guilty of first-degree murder on all counts. The same jury soon recommended the death penalty for all four of them. Now, you're probably wondering, what about Tex Watson? Well, he was tried separately in 1971 and was likewise convicted and sentenced to death. For a brief moment, it appeared that Manson and his murderous acolytes would be headed to California's gas chamber. However, in a twist of fate, those sentences were not carried out. In 1972, the California Supreme Court in People v. Anderson struck down the state's death penalty statute, ruling it unconstitutional. This ruling automatically commuted all existing death sentences to life imprisonment. Thus, all of them had their death sentences reduced to life in prison in 1972, and they even got the possibility of parole. Now, California would later reinstate the death penalty under new laws, but those could, for some reason, not be retroactively applied to the Manson defendants. Now, following the trial, the Manson family core members exchanged their hippie garments for prison uniforms, beginning sentences that, for the most part, would last for the rest of their natural lives. Charles Manson was sent to California's San Quentin and later Vacaville, Folsom, and Corcoran prisons over the years, where he quickly cemented his infamy. He attracted a strange sort of cult following, even behind bars, which is always so disgusting to me. And letters would pour in from curious or enamored members of the public. And then he was granted occasional TV interviews in which his unnerving charisma would be put on full display, complete with riddles, songs, and sudden flashes of anger. Manson became the embodiment of evil for many Americans, the very face of sadistic cult leader. He would ultimately be denied parole dozens of times, and after the late 90s, he stopped attending his parole hearings altogether. He remained manipulative behind bars, reportedly stirring up trouble with other inmates and guards, but age and incarceration finally tempered his ability to cause real harm. Manson died in prison on November 19th, 2017, at the age of 83 from natural causes, most likely cardiac arrest and colon cancer. By the time of his death, he had spent all but 13 years of his entire life in institutional custody of one form or another, a staggering testament to the kind of life he lived, and proof that a lot of damage can be done in a short amount of time. Susan Atkins, who had infamously boasted of tasting Sharon Tate's blood, became California's longest incarcerated female inmate by the time of her death. In prison, Atkins claimed to find religion and expressed remorse for her actions in later years. She actually married twice while incarcerated, once to a second cousin of famed CEO John W. Hinckley, and later to a Harvard graduate who then became her attorney. Like what? But Atkins developed brain cancer and was bedridden by the late 2000s. She made a highly publicized bid for compassionate release in 2009, which was denied despite her terminal condition. I don't think she gave anyone else mercy, did she? She died that year in prison at 61 years old, having been denied parole 14 times over the decades. Patricia Krenwinkel, who had chased down and stabbed Abigail Folger, remains in prison to this day. After Atkins' death, Krenwinkel became the longest serving woman in the California prison system. And now in her 70s, she's been denied parole more than a dozen times, most recently in 2017. In 2022, a parole board actually recommended her release, citing her age and decades of good behavior, but California's governor intervened and overturned that recommendation, keeping Krenwinkel behind bars. The political and public appetite to release a participant in the Manson killings has historically been, as you probably guessed it, very low. Leslie Van Houten, the youngest of the convicted killers, who was only 19 at the time of the murders, has had one of the more complicated post-trial stories. In prison, she was often described as a model inmate. She earned college degrees and was involved in rehabilitation programs. Her initial conviction was actually overturned in 1976 due to a mistrial. Her attorney had disappeared during the original trial and later turned up dead, which tainted the proceedings. She was retried and convicted again in 1978 and sentenced to life. Now, over the years, she was recommended for parole multiple times by parole boards, only to have those recommendations reversed by California's governors. And finally, in July 2023, after 53 years in custody, Leslie Van Houten was released on parole at age 73. Public sentiment had gradually shifted, acknowledging that she'd been a teenager under Manson's domination and had demonstrated genuine remorse and rehabilitation. Her release marked the first and only time any convicted Manson family murderer has been set free. Her freedom, however, came with very strict conditions and the understanding that any misstep would return her to custody. And as for Tex Watson, the principal killer in both massacres, still remains incarcerated. In the 70s, Watson underwent a jailhouse conversion to Christianity and later became an ordained minister and famously published an autobiography titled, "Will You Die for Me?" In it, he described his own perspective of the crimes and took responsibility for his actions, though he too has sought parole multiple times. Watson has been denied parole 17 times as of 2021. He continues to serve his life sentence in a California prison and is now in his 70s. And other family members faced much different fates. Bruce Davis, who was involved in the murders of Gary Hinman and Shorty Shea, but not the Tate-LaBianca murders, was convicted in 1972 and also sentenced to life. He too became a born-again Christian in prison. Parole boards have recommended his release several times in recent years, but governors blocked the release each time, citing the heinous nature of his crimes. Steve Clem Grogan astonishingly did get out. He had been convicted of Shorty Shea's murder. Considered intellectually limited, Grogan showed authorities where Shea's body was buried as an act of contrition. In 1985, Grogan was paroled, making him one of the very few Manson family members convicted of murder to be released, a freedom earned through cooperation and the perception that he was no longer a danger. One figure notably not prosecuted for the 1969 murders was Lynette Squeaky Frome. Though Frome was part of the family and a fixture at the trial, often one of those seen outside the courthouse, she wasn't directly involved in the crimes. However, her unwavering loyalty to Manson would lead her to infamy of a different sort. On September 5th, 1975, Frome attempted to assassinate U.S. President Gerald Ford in Sacramento. She pulled out a Colt 45 pistol and aimed it at Ford in close range, though it did not fire. The gun apparently had a round in the chamber, but no magazine in it, so it misfed. Secret Service agents tackled her before she could chamber another round. Frome's stated reason for the attempt was to draw attention to environmental issues, specifically to protest the plight of California redwoods and show loyalty to Manson's ideology that man was destroying nature. Manson had formed an acronym, ATWA, for air, trees, water, and animals. So clever, man, so clever. She was convicted of attempted assassination and then sentenced to life in prison. Frome served 34 years before being paroled in 2009 for attempted murder of a president. Are you kidding me? Even in her interviews after her release, she remained defiant about her love for Manson. Another fiercely loyal family member, Sandra Good, was imprisoned in the 70s for issuing violent threats against corporate executives because she too was fixated on Manson's environmental ideals. Good was released in the 80s but remained under watch. So, by the early 70s, the Manson family as a criminal enterprise was effectively finished. Its leaders and soldiers either locked away or scattered about. Yet, in a broader sense, the family had achieved a dark immortality. The stories of their crimes and the almost unbelievable madness surrounding them took on a life of their own in American consciousness. The saga of Manson and the Manson family is really a grim lesson in the extremes of human influence and the darkness that can lurk beneath utopian ideals. It's a story with no winners, only victims and shattered lives. In the end, what Charles Manson achieved was the infamy he so craved. He became more than a failed musician or a petty crook. He became a symbol of evil reincarnate, a name that will live on in true crime infamy long after his death. His family serves as a warning of how easily a self-styled prophet can pervert the trust of vulnerable followers into blind obedience. Society learned through the Manson case that the face of a killer could wear many guises, even that of a long-haired hippie preaching love. We've learned that cult leaders are often, in truth, deeply ordinary narcissists who exploit extraordinary times and vulnerable people. And Manson's evil wasn't even supernatural. It was frighteningly human. The convergence of a damaged psyche, the drug-fueled 60s, and the pliability of youth. And yet people are still fascinated by him and this case. There are people that still idolize him in this case. And if we wanted to get into all of the nuances and the intricacies, I mean, this video would go on for hours and hours with all of the content that people have made about this at this point. But it is such a scary reminder, and it honestly makes me kind of shocked that we are where we are today when it comes to people understanding undue influence, because this is the most perfect example of how it can work, but people still want to deny it. They still think that they'll never get into a cult, and someone who gets into a cult is somehow weaker minded than them. And this should really serve as a reminder of how easy it is to trust someone and how easy it is if you feel like you lack purpose. It's easy to somehow jump into some kind of mission that provides you with that purpose. It's so, so, so heartbreaking to think about. And honestly, like, I don't know if you guys feel this way, if you're really into cult psychology and learning more about it, or if you've been watching my videos for a really long time. I feel like the whole idea of like, oh, I'd never get into a cult has totally been stripped away because now that I have such a better understanding of the mechanisms of a cult leader and how people get sucked in, I feel like I'm just like looking for the red flags all the time with any group. So I'd be really curious to hear if you feel like now that you've been educated about it, you feel that too sometimes. There are so many situations either a friend will tell me about or I'll start noticing or I'll go to like a group event and I'll be like, this is weird, it's a little culty. It's not maybe a cult per se, but I'm going to keep my distance from it. I don't want to find out necessarily. And I'm just so curious if now you're like, oh, I see all the red flags and I know what to look out for. And I can also recognize in myself while at the right place, at the right time in my life, maybe I would have gotten sucked into something like that. I think that's such a grounded approach to have when kind of consuming these stories and this content. There's one comment I saw on a 48 hours episode on YouTube that was like, I feel like I don't watch this for entertainment. I watch it for survival. I can't tell you how many times a friend has told me something that they do every single day. And I've been like, what are you doing? You could get murdered. So I don't know. I'm kind of rambling now, but I just am so curious if you're starting to feel that way after, I mean, I've been creating this content for, gosh, almost 2 years now and was just like obsessed with cult documentaries for years prior to that. And I feel like I'm finally at a point where I'm like, I really understand like the appeal, but I see the red flags at the same time. It's kind of like this interesting like juxtaposition in my brain, you know? Anyways, rant over. Sorry Gatsby didn't come in to say hi today. She was here earlier and then she kind of dipped out before I started shooting. But as always, thank you guys so much. Let me know what you think about this coverage. Let me know if you learned something new. I learned a few new things, which was really cool in researching this. And I feel like I might like go live and watch some of the trial footage or some of Manson's interviews just as like a fun bonus video. I think that would be a really fun thing to do together. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, please leave a comment down below. And if you made it to the end, drop a devil emoji. Oh, scary, but drop a devil emoji in the comments below. And you're probably like, Erin, please shut up and just do your outro already. So with all of that being said, please have a great rest of your day, your week, and I will see you very soon. Stay safe out there, ask questions, and always stay skeptical. Bye.